Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dale Jarvis. I'm a storyteller and folklorist, and today I'm going to take you on a little introductory journey to the history and folklore of Newfoundland and Labrador. We're going to start off way back in the very, very early days and bring it up to stuff that's happening now in the present. One of the things I think it's really important to note is that we have an incredibly long history in Newfoundland and Labrador. And that goes right back to the last ice age, when the great glaciers retreated. People started to arrive, moving in from the north and spreading out all across the province of Labrador and Newfoundland. The Indigenous peoples were, of course, the first peoples to arrive here, and they lived here for thousands and thousands of years with their own history and stories and folklore and mythology. And then Europeans started to arrive, and we don't know exactly when the first ones came. There's all sorts of myths and legends about when that might be. There's a fabulous story about an Irish monk by the name of Saint Brendan, who sailed in a leather boat across the North Atlantic and who may or may not have arrived in Newfoundland. And he had all kinds of adventures along the way, such as saying mass on the back of a whale, what he thought was an island, but then later turned out to be a great whale. He saw sea monsters and all kinds of things. He may be one of the first Europeans to visit. But we do know for certain from archaeological evidence that the Norse people were the first Europeans to come and build houses on the island of Newfoundland. And if you have an opportunity to visit the Parks Canada site, the National Historic Site, World Heritage Site, actually, at Lansom Meadows, it's definitely worth a trip up the Great Northern Peninsula to see where the Vikings landed all those many, many years ago, around 1,000 years ago, or just over, probably. And they didn't stay very long, but we know from their sagas that they had several visits here, and from archaeological evidence, we know that they were involved in all kinds of different things here on the island of Newfoundland. And like everyone else that visited, they were great storytellers, and they went back and wrote down and told stories about the things that they had experienced, their encounters with Indigenous people, some of which may be more mythological than truthful. One of the things that they claimed to have seen while they were here in what they called Vinland was this group of strange creatures that only had one giant foot, and they moved from place to place by hopping around. And this was a kind of a popular tale in the Middle Ages and travelers' tales from that period. When people came back from strange places, they would often report seeing these unipeds, these men with one feet. And there's actually a story about one shooting an arrow at one of the Norse visitors, and he died here. And then there's also a fabulous story about him kind of coming back as a ghost to give prophecy to his wife. So the Vikings were here. Again, they didn't stay very long. And it wasn't until much later, in the 1500s, really, that Europeans started to arrive in any great numbers. And we know by about 1530 or so, they were establishing fishing premises on the Labrador. The Basque were in Labrador around then. And pretty soon started to visit Newfoundland to fish and build all kinds of structures to prosecute the fishery. And when Newfoundlanders talk about fish, they're really talking about codfish. One of the early records said that the codfish were so plentiful that you could let down baskets from the side of your ship and draw them back up full of fish. So for hundreds of years, people came from all over Europe to exploit the fishery here in Newfoundland. People came from the Basque countries, the French, the Spanish, and then the English and the Irish as well. And it was the English and Irish who kind of stayed and gave this place a character sort of its own. A lot of the people who came from those early who came to Newfoundland in those early settlement days came from the southern parts of Ireland or the West Country of England, and they brought their way of speaking and their language and their customs with them. And a lot of those things today we associate with parts of Newfoundland culture. But it really was the fishing industry that brought people here, and they built structures like this all along the coast. This is what you would call a stage. And this is where fish was processed. So fish would come in little boats, and men would use prongs, kind of like spears or forks, to throw the fish up into these buildings where the women would be waiting. Women and men would clean the fish and then lay it out on great big platforms called flakes, where it would dry. This is an example of a stage here in the community of Towton, I believe, on Fogo Island. And here is another fabulous photo of all this fish, salt fish that's spread out on the flake to dry. It was very labor intensive, and this was largely done for export. So fish was collected here and dried here, and then it was packed into barrels and then shipped off to other parts of the world, including Europe, where it was very important for food, especially in Catholic Europe on Fridays when you couldn't eat meat. There was you always needed a good source of fish. And then eventually a huge trade developed between Newfoundland and the slave plantations in the Caribbean and the American South. And this was part of the history of Newfoundland, that we shipped off all this fish off to the Caribbean. And there are long historical links with our food and our food traditions with the Caribbean. Salt fish is still an important part of the food in the Caribbean countries. Fishing was certainly something that defined the way that our communities looked. This is an old photograph of St. John's here. And there are people alive who will remember that the harbor used to be busy in a very different way than it is today, where the harbor arterial, the harbor apron is today, was a series of what were called finger piers, little piers that jutted out into the water, and all kinds of schooners from all over the world would come. This was a bustling port, and people came on their way to and from other ports in the UK and Europe, the Caribbean, and the Americas. And we had a really flourishing trade, and there were fortunes made on salt fish and on the trade that flowed in and out of St. John's. And it kind of gave St. John's a very particular character that we all have today know and love. It's just an old map of the city of St. John's, and you can see those numerous piers kind of jutting out into the harbor there below. So when you go downtown today, it's a slightly different place than it once was, but you can imagine how busy it must have been, and all the sights and smells that would have been there when it was a very, very busy working port. I wanted to talk a little bit about traditions, and one of the ones that I think is probably very well known is our Christmas mummering tradition. This is a tradition where people dress up in disguise and go from house to house at Christmas time. And it's kind of like a little guessing game. And you go from house to house, you disguise your face and your voice and the way you walk, and your neighbors try to guess who you are. This was a very popular tradition. It's one that people remember with great nostalgia. And it started to fade a little bit in the 1980s, maybe. And there's lots of different reasons for that. I think the biggest reason being that kind of the nature of communities had changed, and people had started to move away, and there were strangers moving into communities. Some people said when people got carpet, they didn't want mummers coming into the house because they didn't want people coming in with their muddy winter boots on and dancing in their kitchen. But for whatever reason, it was a tradition that was here for a very, very long time that had started to fade out. There had been attempts, I guess, made at various times to kind of revitalize the tradition and bring it back. And in 2009, the Heritage Foundation of Newfoundland and Labrador started the Mummers Festival, just to draw attention back to this really beloved tradition and to encourage people to not only participate in the tradition of mummering, but also to record those old stories and to see that that tradition was maintained. And mummering takes a huge variety of forms, depending on where you are, what community you're from. There's no right way or wrong way to mummer. There's just very specific ways that it's done in different communities. But these are some typical examples of mummers dressed up in whatever they have lying around and trying to disguise themselves. It's a great fun tradition, and the Mummers Festival is a great way for people to participate in it if they haven't before. Here are another two fine mummers here. You can see they're all padded out to change the shapes of their bodies. Men often dress as women and women often dress as men just to disguise themselves even just a little bit more. And I think these were two that were taken in the very first year of the Mummers Festival at the Rooms, the Provincial Museum in St. John's. Here are some more, a little bit more elaborate mummers here. I love the one on the right there with her line of washing out behind her. So mummering, like I said, it exists in a whole variety of different forms and different ways, and in different parts of the province there are different types of mummers. We wanted to create an opportunity for people to get together and kind of recreate this idea of going from house to house. The parade, there had been kind of mummers parades in the 1800s, which weren't really organized parades. They were more kind of general promenades, I guess, of people kind of wandering the street. But we wanted to recreate that idea of going from one house to another house. So we had a big dress up party, a rig up party at a school, and we paraded through the streets, and we ended at the Rooms, and everyone went inside and, had a dance and had some music, maybe had a little something to drink. People love a little bit of purity syrup at Christmas and something sweet to eat. And it was a great success, and it continues. We were going to do it for 1 year at the Heritage Foundation, and it was so popular. It is now its own festival with its own volunteers who do all kinds of things to keep that tradition alive. One of the little traditions that is part of the mummering tradition is the hobby horse tradition. This is kind of maybe a slightly more frightening part of Christmas mummering. The hobby horse is a kind of strange looking horse-like creature with biting jaws. You can see there's a little string there on the bottom jaw, so the jaws will kind of snock together, and they'll chase after people and possibly bite you if you get too close. This was, again, a very old tradition, one that had probably come from England with the early settlers. We have records that when Sir Humphrey Gilbert came in the 1500s, he brought a hobby horse with him. And we started some hobby horse workshops to give people the opportunity to come back and learn how to do this themselves. We wanted the festivals to be participatory, so people could make their own hobby horses and learn some traditional skills. So this is one of the hobby horses that was made with a mummer there in the Rooms. I think this is one of our first events. This is actually me. This is me in my hobby horse costume, and it was used for a poster in one of the past mummers festivals. This is more of a hobby donkey, I guess, but people made all kinds of things. They had hobby goats and hobby bulls, all kinds of different creatures that would come out and terrify things. I mentioned how the traditions are different in the province depending on where you are. So if you're in different parts of the province that have a different kind of heritage or a different cultural background, Christmas traditions are different. And Labrador is a really great example of that. This is a photo from Christingle service, which is a really important kind of kickoff to the Christmas season in our Moravian communities on the north. And you'll see some of these old kind of German style traditions. So here we have the candle, which represents Jesus Christ, and the apple, which represents the the world, an important kind of Moravian symbol. And you'll see other types of festivals that happen at different times of the year, so in different parts of the province. One of my favorite is Bonfire Night, which happens on November 5th. This is an old English tradition, and it existed before an attack on Parliament, when Guy Fawkes was and his co-conspirators were caught trying to blow up Parliament. But it was one of the first kind of public holidays in the UK, and it's one that is still practiced here in Newfoundland. It is a tradition that is sometimes more prevalent in Protestant communities. Roman Catholic communities might have their own bonfire night that takes place in midsummer around the festival of St. John the Baptist. So again, traditions change just depending on when you're from. I think this one was from Carbonear. This one was from somewhere out in Central. So they can be quite big. You can see they're quite large bonfires. A great fun and a great way of kind of keeping tradition alive. One of the other things that, of course, is part of any culture are children's games and activities. There's all kinds of things that people do in traditional games. And those might be the paper dolls that we saw. This is from one of our youth heritage forums that was held a couple of years ago when First Light, the Native Friendship Center at that point, came and were teaching the youth who are participating about Inuit games. This is a kind of a high kick competition where you have to see how high you can kick. And there's been a bit of a revitalization of some of those games, bringing them back and encouraging people to do those again. If you are new to Newfoundland, if you've come to Newfoundland from a place that doesn't get a lot of snow in the winter, I would encourage you in the winter to get out and go sliding. Tobogganing is maybe the more Canadian, the Central Canadian term for it. But, get out into the snow. Winters are long in Newfoundland sometimes, and so we need to find ways to enjoy it and get out and do things, and sliding is a great way. This is a photo, historic photo from Cable Avenue in Bay Roberts. This was a community that was kind of planned and created by the cable company, the Transatlantic Cable Company. And the people who lived on the street were all worked for or were associated with the cable company in some way. Other winter activities, include like skating and hockey, which is a really important part of our winter traditions here. And it's a good example of things that people did when they didn't have a lot of money. They would go out and they would create slides with whatever they had around. Old pieces of linoleum or canvas. We collected some great stories about people using the old bonnets of cars to go sliding on, or people would just kind of create fun in whichever way they could, whenever they could. We have a fabulous tradition in Newfoundland of storytelling. Everyone you'll meet will want to tell you some kind of story or another. And if you want to hear some traditional or even some contemporary Newfoundland stories and stories from around the world, there is an annual storytelling festival, which happens in St. John's, and a monthly storytelling circle. During COVID, it's been happening online, but I believe it's coming back, hopefully, to a live venue. It's a great way of kind of getting out and hearing some of those, maybe some of those taller tales. This poster is of a giant squid, something that is another firm part of the folklore and natural history of Newfoundland and Labrador. I talked earlier about how those early legends of when people came, when they would go back home, they would tell stories about the strange monsters that they would meet. And giant squid for a long time were thought to be mythological creatures, but they are actually very real. And this is one of the places in the world where they sometimes come up to the surface and show off. And if you want to see a giant squid, you can go to the rooms, the Provincial Museum in St. John's, and there is a squid in a tank. And you can learn a little bit about the actual science behind the giant squid. One of the other kind of storytelling things that I love in the province is our really rich history of naming things. And this is especially true once you get outside of the urban centers and out into the smaller communities. People had names for everything. Every rock, every hill, every little cove, every little beach had its own name. And Newfoundland place names are a great way to kind of explore and learn a little bit about the cultural history of the place that you're in. So go out and talk to people and get them. What do you call that place there? And I'm sure there's a great story behind it. I mentioned about how our folklore, the settler kind of folklore came from away, and it kind of came and changed, and we have our own way of telling stories and talking about things. And some of these are maybe universal stories, and some of them might be more specific. This is a photograph of a barn door in Brigus in Conception Bay. And the white horse there, it reminds me of stories that my late father-in-law, George Jones, who was from Brigus, told me. He said he was a ship's engineer, and he told me once that men would never talk about horses when they were out on the ocean. If you talked about horses, you would call up a storm. So just a word of warning there. If you're on the Belle Island ferry, you don't want to talk about horses. And the horseshoe below it is a pretty well understood to be a symbol of good luck. In Newfoundland, it was often used for protection in some ways, especially the further back in history you go, the more likely it was used as a protective mark rather than just a good luck charm. And whoever you meet, if you see a horseshoe on their door, there will be a great debate about if it's the right way or the wrong way up. Sometimes people say it has to be like this, shaped like a U to hold the luck in. And other people say, well, you have to turn it up the other way around so that the luck pours down onto you. Either way, when you see those on a door here, they generally, today, they mean kind of a sign of good luck and good fortune. Another part of our folklore that maybe isn't quite so much about good luck is our stories of the little people, the fairies. The fairies in Newfoundland aren't necessarily sweet and gentle kinds of fairies that, like flowers and live in the garden. The fairies in Newfoundland sometimes are creatures rather, that should be very much respected. And if you know a place belongs to the fairies, you should probably stay away from that place, or else all kinds of bad things might happen to you. Fairies were known to steal children away. There was a belief that in some way that fairies either couldn't have children of their own, or they needed a human to be participatory in the process of fairy birth somehow. And there was a tradition here of what people called changelings. And that was where if a mother wasn't careful, the fairies might come and steal their child away, steal their baby, and leave a little changeling baby in its place. Sometimes it looked like the human baby, and sometimes it looked like a little old man. And sometimes it was kind of a combination of those two things. It might be a human child that, spoke like an old person. And then there were things you could do if you wanted to try and convince the fairies to have the changeling return your actual human child. Other stories about the fairies were, people would often get abducted by the fairies and taken away. Sometimes they would think they were only gone a few minutes, but they'd be gone for days. Sometimes when people came back, they would be changed in some way. They would be different. They would be slower in speech, or sometimes people would have a strange wound on their body, a strange bruise, or a strange growth. And sometimes if that was cut open, bits of twigs and bark and feathers and sticks would come out of it. And that was called a fairy blast. So best to leave the fairies alone, really, in Newfoundland. They're not really to be trifled with, I guess you could say. We also have a tradition here of kind of folklore around springs. This is Father Duffy's well, which was said to be kind of a holy spring. And there are all kinds of legends about how Father Duffy, who was an Irish priest, found this well or created this well. My favorite one was that he came across this spot and he was taking a break. He was walking from, I think, Placentia to St. John's. And this stranger challenged him to a wrestling match, and it turned out that the wrestler was the devil himself. And when Father Duffy threw the devil down on the ground, this spring bubbled up. Other people just say it was a spot where he stopped and had something to drink halfway along his way. But it was a spot that people would go and collect the water because they thought the water had special healing properties. And there was a picnic area there, and lots of people would stop there and collect water from the well. Speaking of going out and collecting things, this is another part of our kind of folklore and culture in Newfoundland, especially around this time of year, and that's about going out and collecting all those kinds of edible things that exist that you can go and pick for free out in the Newfoundland wilderness. And blueberries, of course, are one of those very popular fruits to go out and pick. And there is a wide variety of things. And there's again, kind of a growing interest among people to understand better skills around traditional foraging and collecting natural food. And blueberries might be around, at certain times of the year, but in other times of the year, there's other berries. This year, I know, was a really good year for what we here call chuckly pears. In other parts of the world, they call those Saskatoon berries or service berries. But I know I went out this year because they were nice and big and fat and juicy this year. And I went out and I collected a whole bunch of service berries that I've got in my freezer. So again, if you're new to the province, get out and get a Newfoundlander to show you where their secret berry picking spot is. If they will share with you. Sometimes they're very protective of those spots. And they make amazing jams, and there's all kinds of different foods that you can get that are made with local ingredients. Long tradition here of using local things, local ingredients, and making delicious foods. Another little favorite piece of Newfoundland folklore for me is around this particular type of food, which is basically a fried bread dough. So if a woman was baking bread and she had a little bit of dough left over, or a little bit of dough that she saved, she might kind of fry it in a pan and serve it up. And many places in Newfoundland call this a Towton, but there's, again, just depending on what town you're from, there's a huge range of names for these things. Most people know the word Towton, but in their families or the communities that they're from, they might have another word for these as well. So some people call them tiffins or damper dogs or flummies or gandies. There's a bewildering array of names for what these are called. And what you put on them is very important. The kind of traditional thing to put on them is molasses. Again, kind of hearkening back to that long history of trade between Newfoundland and the Caribbean, where people would, go and trade their salt fish for molasses or rum or salt and bring it back to Newfoundland. So it's a great part of our tradition as well that you can go out and eat, along with things like cod's tongues and all those other delicious things that come out of the sea. That I think gives you a little bit of an introduction. Oh, and bread, I mentioned bread making. Bread making is always one of those things that when I ask people about their memories about growing up in Newfoundland, bread is always one of those things that they remember, especially when I ask about what is the smell that reminds you of growing up. People will often talk about the bread that their mother used to make. People made a whole bunch of other things. It wasn't just food. It wasn't just stuff related to the fishery. People made what they needed. A good example of that is our baskets. And there was a very strong basket making tradition here in Newfoundland. This particular type of basket is actually made out of spruce roots. This is spruce root basket from the west coast of Newfoundland. This was a very traditional Mi'kmaq and Indigenous type of basket, though very similar baskets were made by the Acadian people, the French-speaking people. And it is one of these traditions that probably kind of blended back and forth a little bit between settler and Indigenous people. And there still are people today who make spruce root baskets, though it is a skill that isn't maybe quite as popular as it was. Another skill that I think is really interesting is the making of birch brooms. This is Mr. Joshua Young here holding one of his birch brooms. This is a broom that is whittled from one piece of wood. Normally brooms are made by kind of taking a bunch of fibers or sticks and kind of binding them together and tying them together. But if you undid that little tie there on Mr. Young's broom, you would find that it's all one piece of wood. All those pieces are still attached to that main stick. It's quite a remarkable thing. I videotaped this man making one, and that video is actually on YouTube. You can go and you can see the video that we made of him carving a birch broom. One of the other big traditions, of course, in Newfoundland, if you were going to go out and fish, you needed a boat. And you used what you had. And so there was a centuries old tradition of wooden boat building. People would go out into the woods and find the right parts of a tree that had the right curve, and they would make these beautiful, beautiful wooden boats. This is Mr. Jerome Canning here at the Wooden Boat Museum in Winterton, which is working a lot to preserve some of that old folklore and those traditional skills around boat building. Here's some of the gentlemen from the Boat Museum talking about the skills and work that goes into building a boat. And sometimes they teach courses. So if you want to learn some boat building skills yourself, you can look up the Wooden Boat Museum and maybe make a punt yourself. These are some kids there. They have some kids programs. So there are some kids out there learning a little bit about carpentry, maybe not building a boat yet, but building enough of a boat that they had something that they could go play in the stream with. Our textile traditions are really an important part of our heritage here. So all kinds of things that people would knit and make. This is a lady out on the west coast of the island here who is knitting some hats. And that pot of water that's on her stove there, she's going to felt these. So kind of knit the hats and then make them kind of make them bigger than they need to be, and then shrink them down in the water so that they become very close and tight and more waterproof. So it's a very traditional skill underway here. And there's all kinds of knitters in the province going around and making all kinds of beautiful things. And you'll often see these traditional kinds of mittens for sale in craft shops and at the farmer's market. And these are sometimes called trigger mitts, the one there on the very far right. So you'll have a thumb, but you'll also have one finger. So it's kind of I guess if you were out hunting and you needed to pull the trigger on your hunting rifle, you didn't have to take your gloves off, which is where the name comes for that. And there's been a lot of work done, especially by these two lovely ladies, Christine Legros and Shirley Scott, to kind of document all these old traditional patterns that people used to use for creating their knitted goods. And they do a lot of work and have written, I think, 3 books so far together on the traditions of knitting. This is a different kind of textile craft. This was largely done by men. This is called Pillowtop weaving. This was something that men who were off working in the lumber camps would do. They would kind of unravel the wool from their socks, and they would weave these mats that they would then take home to their wives and sweethearts at the end of the logging season. They'd be away for weeks and weeks working in the woods, and when they'd go home, they'd have this lovely piece of art that they could sit on the chair and make the chairs more comfortable. Probably one of our more famous types of fabric or textile arts are our hooked mats. Here they're being hooked on a background. Locally, people would call this brin, it's burlap, and then using material that you kind of poke and push through the backing material to create patterns. People would often recycle fabric and make kind of geometric patterns, or make mats that are more pictorial in some way, depicting kind of Newfoundland scenes. This is, again, something that is very much seen a bit of a resurgence in Newfoundland. There's lots of places you can go. And the hooked mats, which used to go on your floor, are now pretty expensive because it takes a long time to make these, and people are more likely to hang them on their wall than they are to put them on the floor for wiping their boots. And all kinds of other crafts too, not just kind of indoor crafts, but all or fabric crafts, but things like blacksmithing. This is the Green Family Forge out in Trinity, which just won an award this year for its work in maintaining history. This is Wade Ivany there, banging away, making all kinds of things. People, again, if they needed something, they needed someone locally to make it. So making things like horseshoes or tools, or fixing things that needed to be fixed. There was quite a busy business of making horseshoes in many of these little blacksmith shops or forges all around Newfoundland, because the ponies were so important in hauling materials. And as things modernized, we didn't really need blacksmith shops in quite the same way, but we're starting to see people who are really interested in this as a craft and as a tradition. And the blacksmiths who work in the Green Family Forge, they produce a whole range of different kinds of gift items and hooks and garden pieces and knives that they sell to help keep the museum up and running. And we recognize as well that it's not just those traditions that come from England and Ireland that are part of Newfoundland culture. We recognize that people are coming from all over the world, and always have been coming from all over the world to stay and live in Newfoundland and Labrador. This is my friend Maria Lessive here, who's teaching people how to make pierogies here. I think this was a workshop we did a number of years ago in St. John's, and people could come and hear Maria talk about pierogies and Ukrainian culture and have a chance to sample some of that. And this is one of my favorite groups that has been around for a while now in St. John's. This is Bollywood Jig. So a group of women who perform kind of a blend, I guess, in some ways, of Newfoundland and traditional Indian dance, which I love to see. And I think that's it. I think that's it for my slide presentation and for the photos I have to show. I always encourage people, especially those people who are new to St. John's, any chance you get to get out of St. John's and go and explore Newfoundland, go and do it. Get outdoors, meet the people, talk to them. Like I said, Newfoundlanders love telling stories. And if you're curious about things in their community, I'm sure they would be happy to explain them and share them. If you ever get a chance to have a boil up, a mug up, sit around, have some tea, have a conversation, it's probably the best way to find out all these amazing stories about Newfoundland history and folklore. So thank you for listening, and enjoy the rest of the Tombolo Festival, and take care.